Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my Blood Death Knight class guide for Shadowlands Patch 9.1. I'm going to be honest and say I'm not having a great night tonight, but I'm still in a good mood. So hit that like button if you're up with good vibes, even when things are a little down. Alright, now let's move on to what's changed for Blood Death Knights in patch 9.1, and there's really only two things to touch on. First, Anti-Magic Zone was nerfed in two ways. Its duration is 2 seconds shorter, which isn't a huge deal, and it now has a cap worth 150% of the casting DK's health pool. That's a big blow to the utility of DPS DKs, but for Blood, it's still a pretty good raid cooldown, especially if you use Vampiric Blood right before you cast it. Additionally, and on a more positive note, Blood DK gained a 6% total damage buff. Now, given how far below the rest of the competition Blood DKs have been all expansion, that may seem like too little too late, and expansion isn't over yet. Maybe they'll do dumb little 6% buffs again and again a few more times, and that would be enough to make the class competitive over the next year. I can hope. Alright, let's get on to Covenants. Vinthyr is the best all-around Covenant for Blood DKs. Now, I think that Kyrian and Necrolord are both decent alternatives, and I would argue that Necrolord is actually more fun than Vinthyr and Mythic Plus, but it's definitely not as good from a resource generation and defensive consistency perspective. Kyrian deals more single target damage, but let's get one thing clear right off the start. Even the best possible setup for maximizing single target damage as a Blood DK is going to be awful. As a result, I don't think that making a defensive sacrifice in AoE just to boost your horrible single target damage all the way up to still being very bad is a smart trade-off. You could argue that it's defensively competitive or potentially better than Vinthyr to be Kyrian in raids, but I would push back on that somewhat. I think they're pretty comparable defensively, and I just don't love the way that Kyrian plays. And look, in Mythic Plus, Vinthyr is just clearly superior to the rest of the Covenants, and that's true in AoE as well. So, Vinthyr all the way. It fits better thematically anyhow. If you really want to go Necrolord, I respect it, but it's generally not as good. Kyrian, I don't respect it. And Night Fae, please, for your own sake, don't do it. Okay, let's jump into these Soulbinds real quickly. For Vinthyr, you have a great defensive option in General Draven and a decent offensive option with Nagia. You can go with Nagia. She offers some nice stat buff procs, and that's great, but it's not nearly as reliable as the constant defensive value that you get out of General Draven. Draven has gained a lot of offensive value in patch 9.1 thanks to his new Into the Tree trait that grants 3% more damage and damage reduction when you're tanking in AoE. It's great. And finally, Necrolords have 3 trees that are all pretty interesting and I would say decently competitive, but Emily is the one that I prefer the most. I think she really stands out from the pack. Alright, now let's quickly cover Conduits. Blood Death Knight potency Conduits are generally pretty bad. Withering Plague is the one good option available, and it's not a huge DPS increase by any means, but it's okay and it should be your first choice. After that, your Covenant-specific Conduit will be your second best option, and it really won't be huge, but again, it's okay. And third is Debilitating Malady, which is literally the worst potency conduit in the entire game. It's insanely undertuned, and honestly, it's kind of embarrassing that they've left it like this despite now having been given like more than a year of feedback that this bonus grants something like a dozen DPS at Mythic Raid item level. It's bad. Patch 9.1 has added Adaptive Armor Fragment to all tank specs as sort of a general potency conduit option. And it's fine, For Blood DK, this will wind up being what you want to run as your third potency conduit if you path through a third potency conduit slot. Fortunately for Blood DK, their endurance conduits do help make up a little bit for their underwhelming potency conduits. Meat Shield adds extra duration and defensive value onto Dancing Rune Weapon. It's very simple, but also very good. Hardened Bones makes Lichborn into a minor defensive cooldown, which is really a nice addition to an already well-stocked defensive toolkit. And third, I would say Reinforced Shell can be really good if you're in a position, generally in raid, where the default size of AMZ just isn't big enough and you need the extra radius to cover the whole raid or more people that you're trying to fit into it. Otherwise, I would say it's not worth giving up a personal defensive power to just get this for using it all the time. And also, patch 9.1 added Condensed Animosphere, and the amount of self-healing it provides is so tiny that it's absolutely not even worth considering. Now let's get on to Finesse Conduits, which are fine. Spirit Drain makes Interrupting grant you runic power. It's very good if you're in a situation where you have the chance to interrupt. Extremely good in Mythic Plus and on some boss fights. But it is worthless in all the situations where you're not able to interrupt. Basically, when it's good, it's great. When it's bad, it's worthless. Chilled Resilience is sort of a more boring general conduit that just shaves some of the cooldown off of Icebound Fortitude. It's okay, but it's not huge. It does make me wonder, why is this finesse instead of endurance? It doesn't really make sense. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and there are only two pieces I really need to talk about here. And before I move on, Domination Sockets don't make Legendaries in the head, shoulders, chest, bracers, and glove slots. Right. First is Crimson Rune Weapon, which is the more defensive option of the two, and it is a really good defensive choice. I think this will be generally the default legendary for most players. It grants you way more uptime on Dancing Rune Weapon and really helps the rotation flow a lot more smoothly. It forces you to plan your rotation out more thoroughly. You don't want to Marrow Rend your way back up to 9 or 10 Bone Shield charges and then immediately use Dancing Rune Weapon. That would be wasting 5 Bone Shield charges. That's a big waste of resources. That being said, when you perform the rotation skillfully, this legendary is really the glue that holds the whole class together and keeps it flowing smoothly without really needing much attention from a healer at all. The other legendary is Super Strain, and it's very simple. It adds a bunch of damage, or some damage. It also adds a little bit of runic power generation through Frost Fever. It doesn't alter your playstyle, and it's really not a choice you should use for anything that's difficult to tank. You should use this to maximize your pathetic blood DK damage and pretty much nothing else. Before I move on, I will add there are some new Covenant-specific legendaries, and while some people have convinced themselves that the new Night Fae legendary makes that Covenant good for blood, those people are delusional. All 4 of the Covenant legendaries for blood DK suck. Let's move on to talents. Blood DK basically has a good Mythic Plus setup, a good raid setup, and then a couple of talents that you can kind of swing back and forth based on personal preference or situational needs. I put the general Mythic Plus setup on the left here and the raid setup on the right. In the first tier, you have the choice between the extra runic power generation from Heartbreaker or the direct single target damage from Blood Drinker. Anytime you're tanking groups of enemies, I would prefer Heartbreaker. It's just defensively more reliable. Blood Drinker is fine, but it's really just there to maximize your single target damage output, and, you know, that's about it. In Tier 3, you can choose between Blood Tap and Relish in Blood. I don't really think it's a competitive choice. Blood Tap is just clearly a much better talent, but it does require that you actually use it effectively. If you're feeling lazy, Relish in Blood is still good enough and the class is still good enough defensively that you can get away with that. Grip of the Dead really helps Blood DKs with kiting in Mythic Plus, and it turns Death and Decay into an amazing AoE slow if you need one of those in raids. If you don't need a slow in raids, and you usually don't, you're better off just getting an extra movement cooldown in Wraithwalk, even though Wraithwalk kinda sucks. I've hated Wraithwalk since it was added in Legion, but the reality is this: a bad mobility skill is still better than no mobility skill. Voracious is better defensively and will give you more self-healing than Bloodworms, but Bloodworms add damage and little emergency self-heals. The emergency self-heals really don't make up for the lost healing from Voracious, so I would only take Bloodworms if I were trying to parse, and again, parsing as a Blood DK, that's like being the best at coming in 6th place, but, you know, if you need to add damage for your raid to kill something, or you're bored defensively and, you know, you're not gonna shield the boss to death, it's an option for adding a tiny bit more damage. And finally, all the options in the last tier have some use. Purgatory is definitely the weakest. It's really only useful for very specific applications in progression raiding. Having more vampiric blood uptime from Red Thirst will be more likely to save your life than simply having one Purgatory proc on a 4-minute cooldown. Red Thirst is very good. I would say it's the default talent most of the time, and it's one of my favorite talents in any of the tank trees. Bone Storm really isn't great. It's an okay offensive cooldown. Its damage is underwhelming. Its healing can be pretty decent in AoE, and it's pretty expensive when you consider that it basically costs 2.5 Death Strikes to use. But for pumping out as much AoE damage as you possibly can, it's not bad. It does give you an easy way to quickly dump rage if you're Venthyr and you use Swarming Mists in AoE. When it comes to Blood Death Knight's rotation, the old adage of easy to learn and difficult to master is really the perfect description. At the core of the class, you just want to use Dancing Rune Weapon as much as you can, always stay at 7 or more Bone Shield charges, and then never let your runes or Blood Boil sit on cooldown, and never let your RP cap. That all winds up being easier said than done, and the biggest difficulty in the learning curve of Blood DK is that you won't just immediately notice a mistake that you've made in your rotation. Instead, they accumulate and show up later on when you're out of resources. To take Warrior as like a counter example, if you let shield block fall off and you fail to use the defensive cooldowns, you'll probably take a few big hits and then die. You're dead. As a DK, if you Marrow Rend when you're at 9 stacks of Bone Shield, and maybe do that a couple of times, you probably won't get punished for it until 10 or 15 seconds later when you're low on health, short on runic power, and you don't have any runes available or any cooldowns left. Instead of being able to quickly heal yourself back up, you then die. But there's a noticeable delay between making a mistake and being punished for it that really isn't there, I think, for any other tank class. I don't really know what to say about defensive cooldowns for Blood DK. It's obviously worth mentioning because they have such an absolutely humongous bag of defensive cooldowns that are really ready to suit virtually every situation you can encounter as a tank. I would guess use them as you need them. I really like Red Thirst because it lets me have Vampiric Blood up so much in Mythic Plus, and I really use that cooldown a lot. That's sort of square one for me when it comes to using a defensive cooldown. If you're taking a big predictable boss hit, then, you know, Rune Tap prior to the hit and Death Strike afterwards. That's a Blood DK 1-2 combo. When you're dealing with some sort of ugly magic debuff or some sort of hit that leaves a debuff behind, or just a lot of magic damage, anti-magic shell, pretty easy. It beats so many raid and Mythic Plus mechanics. Well, anyway, let's move on to stats. The basic stat priority for Blood Death Knight is pretty much the same as it has been in the past couple of expansions. Versatility is extremely good. It increases your healing, decreases your damage taken, and really is your best stat all around. But haste is also extremely good. It speeds up your rune regeneration, makes your GCDs faster, and all of that helps with reaction time and generally makes the class feel a lot more forgiving and active and fun. Ultimately, both of these stats are about equal, and the real determining factor on which you should want more of is just simply which do you have more of on your gear. If it's haste, and it usually is haste, you probably want to gem and enchant for versatility. If it's versatility, you might prefer gemming for haste instead. Versatility is more reliable defensively, so if you're just going for pure defensive gearing, I would stick with that. But if you want more damage output, I would recommend simming yourself to be sure. If you're really just trying to pump out max damage, crit's probably going to be your best stat. Mastery and crit are both okay defensively. Crit is really good offensively, but it's the least consistent defensively. So I think versatility generally offers you the best of all possible worlds. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are item level and sockets, then versatility and haste, and then the rest of the stats, you know, whatever. As for weapon enchant, I recommend Fallen Crusader. Some people like Rune of Hysteria for the random increases to RP generation it gives. They find that that's helpful defensively, and that makes sense. But I just prefer the more direct and consistent, rotationally consistent value of Fallen Crusader. Now let's move on to trinkets, and there are some interesting ones from dungeons and raids that I'd like to highlight. Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall is a simple single target DPS increase from Mythic Plus. It's totally passive, but it's very good in raids. The best defensive trinket from Mythic Plus, and I think the best defensive trinket in the game, is Blood Splattered Scale, still screwing up that name. It comes from the other side. Basically, as a tank, if you're really looking to get your gear as good as you can, you kind of want to live in the other side until you get one of these trinkets. It's just terrific. None of the trinkets from Tazavesh, the new mega dungeon, seem all that insanely good, but Solea's secret technique is a decent secondary stat buff trinket that I think is pretty good while you're still gearing up. The best trinkets from Castle Nathria are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire Denathrius, of course, and Stone Legion Heraldry from the Stone Legion Generals. If you need a cheat death trinket, then I would say Splintered Heart of Alar from Sun King's Salvation is... it's okay. It's the best cheat death trinket available in this expansion still, even with Sanctum of Domination about to come out. It's better than the option you get from there. I would say most of the new trinkets from Sanctum of Domination aren't all that special. They're relatively boring, but there are a couple I want to point out, one in particular, and that is Old Warrior's Soul. It drops off of Sylvanas, and it provides an absolutely massive amount of haste that slowly stacks up over the first minute and 40 seconds of a fight. When you drop combat, it turns into a 15-second buff, so you can still have some time to get into your next pull before it falls off. It's amazing. Whispering Shard of Power was nerfed since I put out my Warrior video, and I suspect it's no longer very good. I think it had its haste value reduced by 30%. But, you know, I don't know. It might have had its proc chance increased to compensate. We don't really know yet. I tested it a lot, and it just seemed to spawn a little ad that I had to tab target to an auto attack to get that big haste buff from it. It is flagged as a DPS only option, so you'll have to set your loot spec to Frost or Unholy in order to get it. Again, it seemed decent pre-nerf, but, you know, in my testing, it was around a 1 proc per minute, which is pretty normal. But I've heard, at least anecdotally from some other people, and I mean, I guess my experience is anecdotal as well, but I had somebody say that their proc rate was more like every 3 minutes, which would be insanely bad. I don't know, I didn't think it was that bad, but it might be now. It really just depends. Who knows? Buyer beware. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis from the 9 is not a huge defensive boost, but it's an okay defensive on use option, and it does seem like it could do a pretty good burst of AoE damage in Mythic Plus. I don't think there are going to be a ton of fights in this raid where you're going to be able to really throw out a huge AoE burst, but maybe Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas, and those are two of the more important fights, so yeah, maybe it'll be good in raid 2. Maybe. Decanter of Endless Howling from Soul Render Dormazane seems like a good trinket on paper. Again, going back to anecdotal testing, I found its proc chance to be lower than 1 per minute during raid testing playing with this. So I would say buyer beware. It's definitely more of an offensive oriented trinket. It could be good. It's probably more middle of the road. Reactive Defensive Matrix from Guardian of the First Ones is also interesting, but again, kind of like Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, I think there's some issues with it in raid. I think the biggest issue is that you need to be constantly tanking to really get good value out of it, and I found its proc rate to be kind of underwhelming. Since Sanctum of Domination's fights are basically all taunt swaps, I don't like the idea of this trinket in raid. In Mythic Plus, it might be a little better, or a lot better, actually. Weave of Warped Fates is the last trinket I want to talk about from Sanctum of Domination, and it's a pretty weird cheat death trinket that gives you some control over when you decide to come back to life, but you'll be missing all your buffs, you won't have threat. I don't really like it. It's sort of like a free soul stone. I'm not a fan. And lastly, I just want to talk briefly about special weapons that come from the raid. Death Knights are in a bit of a privileged position in terms of weapons. They get Jaethus as a drop from Kel'Thuzad, which is a higher item level weapon than is available from Mythic Plus or the first 8 bosses in the raid. It's worth pointing out that the last 2 bosses do not drop weapons for agility tanks. And on top of that, unlike Warrior and Paladin, who do get higher item level weapon and shield from the last 2 bosses, Jaethus isn't a regular weapon. If you feed it other weapons, which is an interesting concept, it starts to lose its secondary stat budget and instead gains a direct damage proc. I don't really think this will wind up being a huge deal, but it is neat, and it's something out of the next raid that can make DKs feel special. Patch 9.1 is here already, and it's brought a lot of new interesting stuff with it. Blood Death Knights are in, I think, a really good spot right now. They're extremely tanky, and they have a huge bag of defensive cooldowns, and that really makes life easy for their healers. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Blood Death Knights and Shadowlands Patch 9.1, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.